The hum of the engine was all I could hear as I drove down the deserted highway. The darkness stretched out before me like an endless void, broken only by the faint glow of my headlights and the occasional flicker of a distant neon sign. I had been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with fatigue, but I wasn't going to stop. Not yet. The night seemed to go on forever, and the road ahead was an unforgiving black ribbon. That's when I saw it. A small gas station barely visible in the thick fog that clung to the ground like a ghostly shroud. The sign was old and flickering, casting an eerie yellow light across the station's cracked pavement. Foster's Gas and Service, the sign read. Below it, in faded red letters, was a warning that made me chuckle. Pump 13 out of order. Do not use. Superstition. That's all it was. I'd heard the stories from other truckers, how people who used Pump 13 never made it to their destination. How they simply vanished without a trace. It was nonsense, an old wives' tale to scare rookies and drifters. I wasn't about to buy into it. I pulled the truck up to the station, my headlights illuminating the old pumps. There it was, Pump 13. It stood apart from the others, its hose hanging limply like a dead snake. There was nothing special about it, nothing that should have made me uneasy. But as I killed the engine and the night silence crept in, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that crawled up my spine. Stepping out of the cab, the air hit me. Cold, unnaturally cold for a summer night. I zipped up my jacket and glanced around. No other cars, no signs of life. The place was a ghost town. Only the low hum of the station's lights and the distant howl of wind through the nearby trees kept me company. I walked over to Pump 13, the cracked pavement crunching beneath my boots. My fingers grazed the cold metal handle as I yanked the nozzle from its cradle. A quick glance at the meter showed the pump was still active, despite the warning. Out of order, my ass, I muttered under my breath, sliding the nozzle into my truck's fuel tank. As the gas flowed, the wind seemed to pick up, whistling through the rusted metal roof of the station. I could hear it rattling the windows of the old abandoned service shop next door. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, but when I glanced over my shoulder, there was no one there, just darkness and shadows. I turned back to the pump, and that's when I saw it. The numbers on the meter, they were wrong. The digits were moving faster than they should, racing upward like a countdown. 20 gallons, 40 gallons, 100 gallons, 300 gallons. I yanked the nozzle out of the tank, but the numbers kept climbing. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the pump, unable to look away. Something wasn't right. This wasn't possible. Suddenly the meter stopped, the final reading 666.6 gallons. A chill ran down my spine as I took a step back. The air around me grew heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite explain. It felt like the world was pressing in on me, suffocating me with an unseen force. Then without warning, the lights in the station flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness, the only sound the deafening silence of the night. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. No light, nothing. A low growl echoed from somewhere in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on gravel. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look. A shadow moved just beyond the reach of the dim light from my truck's interior. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its form was twisted, distorted in ways that made my stomach churn. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I stumbled back toward the truck, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the door handle. The footsteps grew louder, faster. The shadow was coming closer, its shape shifting with each step. I threw myself into the cab and slammed the door shut, locking it as quickly as I could. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted it, praying the engine would roar to life. It didn't. The truck was dead. The shadow was at the window now, its face pressed against the glass. I couldn't see its features, but I could feel its breath on the glass, hot and foul. The window began to fog up, and as I watched, a single word appeared in the condensation, scratched into the glass by an unseen hand. Run. I didn't wait. I threw open the passenger door and bolted into the night, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet drowned out by the deafening silence that seemed to swallow everything around me. My lungs burned as I ran, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I don't know how far I ran or how long, but eventually I found myself standing in the middle of the highway, gasping for breath. The gas station was nowhere in sight. The only sound was the pounding of my heart and the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle. Headlights appeared on the horizon, growing brighter as they approached. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms, desperate for help. The truck slowed as it neared, and the driver rolled down his window. "You all right, buddy?" he called out, his voice gruff but concerned. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. All I could do was nod, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. "Need a ride?" he asked, eyeing me with suspicion. I hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the darkness behind me. Then I nodded again and climbed into the truck. As we drove off into the night, I glanced in the side mirror, half expecting to see that shadowy figure standing in the road watching me leave. But there was nothing. Just the empty highway stretching out behind us. I tried to convince myself it was over, that whatever had happened at Foster's Gas and Service was behind me, but deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't over. Not yet. And somehow, I knew it had only just begun. The ride was quiet. Too quiet. The driver, a grizzled man in his late 50s, didn't say much. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the cracked leather. The radio crackled with static, the faint strains of some forgotten country song struggling to be heard over the interference. I tried to focus on the music, to let it distract me from the events at the gas station, but the unease gnawed at my insides like a parasite. "Where you headed?" the driver finally asked, breaking the silence. "Anywhere but here," I mumbled, my voice shaky. He grunted in response, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Long night, huh? You have no idea." We drove for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. The darkness outside was suffocating, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Occasionally I'd catch a glimpse of something moving out in the fields, a flicker of motion, a shadow darting between the trees, but every time I blinked, it was gone. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fear that clouded my mind. Maybe I was just seeing things. Maybe whatever had happened back there was some kind of hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had followed me, something malevolent. The driver slowed the truck as we approached a small diner on the side of the road. Its neon sign buzzed weakly, casting an eerie red glow over the parking lot. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s, the windows smudged with years of grime. "Hungry?" the driver asked, pulling into the lot. "Could use a bite myself." I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to keep moving, to not stop for anything. But my stomach growled in response, and I realized just how hungry I was. I hadn't eaten in hours, and the thought of food, even from a place like this, was tempting. "Yeah, sure," I finally said, forcing a smile. "Why not?" We stepped out of the truck, the cool night air brushing against my skin. I glanced around the lot, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the diner, bathed in that sickly red light. Inside, the place was empty except for an old woman behind the counter. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were a faded blue that seemed to stare right through me. She didn't say a word as we sat down at a booth near the back. The driver ordered a coffee and I got a burger and fries, though I wasn't sure I could stomach it. The woman shuffled off to the kitchen without so much as a glance in our direction. I sat there in silence, my mind racing. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint noise from the kitchen made me jump. My hands wouldn't stop trembling and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting that shadow to be standing at the door, waiting for me. "What happened back there?" the driver asked suddenly, his voice low and rough. I looked up at him, my heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean? At the gas station? You looked like you'd seen a ghost when I picked you up." I hesitated, unsure of how to explain it. Would he believe me if I told him? Hell, did I even believe myself? I don't know, I finally said. Something wasn't right. The pump, it started acting strange. Then the lights went out and I saw something. I don't know what it was, but it was wrong. The driver narrowed his eyes, his expression unreadable. "Pump 13? I nodded slowly, a chill running down my spine. "You've heard of it?" "Everyone around here has," he said, leaning back in his seat. "They say it's cursed, that anyone who uses it never makes it to where they're going. Some say it's a portal, a gateway to somewhere else." I felt a lump form in my throat. "You believe that?" He shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. "Don't know what to believe, but I've heard stories. Strange things happen on this road. People go missing, never to be seen again. Some say it's the work of something, not of this world. I stared at him, my pulse quickening. And you picked me up anyway? He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Figured you could use a little help. Besides, I've been on this road a long time. Seen things you wouldn't believe. Thought maybe I'd be able to lend a hand, keep you safe. The old woman returned with our food, placing it on the table without a word. I tried to eat, but every bite felt like ash in my mouth. My mind was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The diner's front door creaked open, and a cold draft blew in. I looked up, my heart stopping in my chest. A man stood in the doorway, but he wasn't any ordinary man. His skin was gray, almost corpse-like, and his eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to absorb the light around them. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there staring at us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. The driver didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't let on. He kept sipping his coffee, his gaze fixed on the table. I glanced at the old woman behind the counter, but she didn't seem to notice the man either. It was like I was the only one who could see him. The man took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The sound of his boots on the floor echoed through the empty diner, each step sending a jolt of terror through my body. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, my heart pounding in my chest. The man kept walking, his gaze never leaving mine. He stopped just inches from our table, his lifeless eyes boring into me. Then without warning, he reached out and grabbed my arm. His touch was ice cold, and the moment his fingers wrapped around my wrist, a searing pain shot through my body. I gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. The driver looked up, his eyes widening in shock as he finally saw the man. He jumped to his feet, knocking over his coffee, but before he could do anything, the man spoke. "You used the pump," he whispered, his voice a raspy, otherworldly hiss. "Now it's your turn." The pain in my arm intensified, spreading through my body like wildfire. My vision blurred, the edges of my world fading to black. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the man's hollow eyes, staring into my soul. Then, there was nothing but darkness. When I came to, the world around me was different, wrong in every possible way. I wasn't in the diner anymore. The faint smell of grease and stale coffee was replaced by something far worse, the sharp metallic scent of blood mixed with decay. I tried to move, but my body was frozen, paralyzed by an unseen force. I could hear faint sounds, distorted and distant, like muffled cries or whispers just beyond the reach of comprehension. My eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light around me, and slowly, the surroundings came into focus. I was in the gas station again. But this wasn't the Foster's gas and service I had stumbled upon earlier. No, this place was a twisted reflection of it. A nightmare version where the walls seemed to pulse, as if alive, and the floor was slick with something dark and wet. The pumps outside were in ruins, crumbling under the weight of time and rot, and Pump 13 stood at the center of it all, untouched but looming like a malevolent entity. A low, guttural growl rumbled from somewhere behind me, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wasn't alone here. Something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. I could feel its eyes on me, hungry, waiting. I tried to move again, but my limbs refused to cooperate. It was as if I had been pinned in place by invisible hands, trapped in this horrifying version of reality. Panic surged through me as I struggled against the paralysis, but it was no use. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The shadow. The same one I had seen at the gas station earlier, but now it was clearer, more defined. It was no longer just a formless figure in the dark. It had shape, substance, and it was smiling, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. The shadow moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. I could hear it now, the sound of its breath, heavy and ragged like the death rattle of a dying animal. "Why?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. "Why me?" The shadow stopped, its grotesque smile never faltering. For a moment, it didn't answer. It simply watched me, relishing in my fear. Then, in a voice that was both familiar and alien, it whispered, "You took what wasn't yours." The words sent a jolt of terror through me. What did that mean? What had I taken? I hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't broken any rules. I had just used the pump. I was about to scream, demand answers, when something strange happened. The shadow flickered like a glitch in a film reel. For a brief moment it wasn't the monster I had come to fear, it was me. I saw my own reflection in the shadow, my face twisted in horror, my eyes hollow and empty. And then, just as quickly it was gone, replaced by the grinning nightmare once more. "You're a part of it now," the shadow hissed, its voice a chilling echo. "You belong to Pump 13. A surge of adrenaline shot through me and suddenly my body responded. With a burst of strength I didn't know I had, I broke free from the invisible grip that had held me in place. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and bolted for the door. But the world around me warped with each step. The walls twisted and shifted, the floor buckled beneath my feet. The gas station was alive and it wasn't going to let me go. I could hear the shadow behind me, its laughter echoing through the warped space as I desperately tried to find a way out. I reached the door and threw it open, only to find myself standing in front of Pump 13. No matter how far I ran, how fast, I kept ending up here, at this cursed place. The ground beneath the pump began to crack and crumble, and from the fissures, thick, black tendrils emerged, slithering across the pavement like hungry serpents. They wrapped around the base of the pump, dragging it down into the earth. And as it sank, the entire station seemed to collapse in on itself, folding into the darkness. I screamed, stumbling backward, but there was no escape. The tendrils reached for me, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me toward the abyss that had formed beneath the pump. I clawed at the ground, desperately trying to hold on, but the pull was too strong. As I was dragged closer to the edge, I caught a glimpse of something in the darkness below. Faces, dozens of them, twisted, contorted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. I recognized some of them. Faces I had seen in missing persons reports, faces I had heard about in the stories truckers told around the fire. They were all here, the ones who had vanished after using Pump 13, and now I was about to join them. The last thing I saw before I was pulled into the darkness was the shadow standing at the edge of the abyss, watching with that twisted smile. Its voice echoed in my mind, a final chilling whisper, "Welcome home." Then everything went black. I don't know how long I was in that darkness, minutes, hours, days. Time had no meaning here. All I knew was that I was no longer alone. The faces I had seen below the pump surrounded me now, their hollow eyes staring into the void, their mouths still open in silent screams, and in the distance I could hear the sound of a gas pump endlessly ticking away as the numbers climbed higher and higher. 666.6 gallons, over and over again. This was my eternity now.